Picture this: a Roman emperor who declared war on the sea itself, commanding his soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as spoils of victory. An Aztec ruler who believed he was made of glass and refused to sit down for fear of shattering. A Byzantine empress who had 10,000 people murdered in a single day because voices in her head told her it was God's will. These aren't fictional characters from a horror novel. These are real rulers who held the fate of millions in their hands. Throughout history, the thin line between genius and madness has been walked by some of the most powerful people who ever lived. And when that line was crossed, entire civilizations paid the price. Tonight, we're going to explore 10 rulers whose descent into madness didn't just destroy their own lives, it changed the course of human history forever. What you're about to discover will make you question everything you think you know about power, sanity, and the fragile nature of civilization itself. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes, they're sitting on thrones. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History knows him as Caligula, meaning little boots, a childhood nickname that would become synonymous with absolute terror. When he took power in Rome in 37 AD, the people celebrated. Finally, they thought, an end to the paranoid rule of Tiberius. They had no idea they had just welcomed a monster into their midst. At first, Caligula seemed like the answer to Rome's prayers. He freed political prisoners, gave generous bonuses to the military, and put on spectacular games for the people. For 7 months, he was everything Romans hoped for in an emperor. Then something changed. Some historians believe it was an illness, a severe fever that left him unconscious for days. Others think the absolute power simply corrupted an already unstable mind. When Caligula recovered from his mysterious illness, he was no longer the same person. He had become something else entirely. Something that believed it was a god. The transformation was gradual at first. He began dressing as various Roman gods during public appearances. He would appear as Jupiter, complete with fake beard and thunderbolt, or as Diana, wearing women's clothing and hunting attire. The Roman people, accustomed to eccentric behavior from their rulers, initially found it amusing. They had no idea what was coming. Caligula's delusions of divinity grew stronger each day. He ordered that his statue be placed in temples throughout the empire, replacing statues of actual gods. He demanded to be worshipped as a living deity. When the Jewish population of Alexandria refused to place his image in their synagogues, he threatened to destroy their entire community. This wasn't just ego. This was the mind of a man who genuinely believed he had transcended humanity. But it was his relationship with his horse, Incitatus, that revealed the true depth of his madness. Caligula didn't just love this horse, he treated it as his equal, perhaps even his superior. He built Incitatus a marble stable with ivory stalls and purple blankets. The horse drank wine from golden cups and ate oats mixed with gold flakes. Caligula threw elaborate dinner parties where Incitatus was the guest of honor, complete with its own golden collar and a house with 18 servants. The most shocking moment came when Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. To modern ears, this sounds like a bizarre joke, but Caligula was deadly serious. He saw this appointment as perfectly logical. After all, he reasoned, if he was a god, then surely his divine horse was more qualified to serve in government than any mere mortal senator. The Roman elite watched in horror as their emperor conducted serious political meetings with his horse. Caligula would whisper to Incitatus during Senate sessions, then announce the horse's opinions on matters of state. He claimed the animal gave him military advice and helped him make important judicial decisions. Senators, who had once commanded legions, found themselves taking orders that allegedly came from a horse. This wasn't just eccentricity, it was a complete break from reality, and the consequences were devastating. Caligula began executing people based on dreams he claimed to have. He would wake up and declare that the gods had visited him in his sleep, ordering him to kill specific individuals. Sometimes these were political enemies, but often they were random citizens whose only crime was appearing in the emperor's nightmares. One of the most chilling examples of his madness occurred during a bridge-building project. Caligula ordered the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, a distance of over 3 miles. When engineers protested that it was impossible and unnecessary, Caligula had them executed for defying a god. The bridge was built at enormous cost in both money and lives. But the purpose of this bridge revealed the depth of his delusion. Caligula didn't build it for transportation or military purposes. He built it so he could ride across the bay wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, proving to the world that he could accomplish the impossible. He spent 2 days riding back and forth across this bridge, claiming he was demonstrating his power over the sea itself, the same sea that had once challenged the gods. This incident led to one of the most bizarre military campaigns in human history. Caligula decided that since he had conquered the Bay of Naples, he should wage war against Neptune himself. He marched his legions to the English Channel and ordered them to attack the ocean. Thousands of Roman soldiers stood on the beach, stabbing at waves with their swords and hurling spears into the water. When his soldiers looked confused, Caligula explained that they were fighting Neptune's army. He pointed at the foam and spray, claiming these were the enemy's war formations. For hours, the most disciplined military force in the world fought a battle against the tide. When Caligula finally declared victory, he ordered his men to collect seashells as spoils of war, calling them treasures of the defeated ocean. The soldiers filled their helmets with shells, which Caligula then displayed in Rome as proof of his divine victory over the sea gods. He threw a triumph parade celebrating his conquest of Neptune, forcing the entire city to participate in honoring his imaginary military achievement. The people of Rome watched their emperor parade through the streets, displaying seashells as if they were the crown jewels of a conquered nation. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Caligula's madness was his unpredictability. He could be charming and generous one moment, then order mass executions the next. He once forced a father to watch his son's execution, then immediately invited the man to dinner, expecting him to laugh and joke as if nothing had happened. When the father couldn't hide his grief, Caligula had him killed too, calling him a poor dinner companion. His reign of terror lasted less than 4 years, but the damage was immense. He bankrupted the Roman treasury with his wild spending on games, buildings, and his horse's luxury lifestyle. He destroyed relationships with client kingdoms and nearly provoked rebellions throughout the empire. Most importantly, he shattered the Roman people's faith in the stability of their government. The end came in 41 AD, when a group of senators and Praetorian guards finally acted. They cornered Caligula in an underground passage of his palace and stabbed him 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were also murdered to prevent any future claims to power. When news of his death spread through Rome, the people's reaction was telling. Not grief, but overwhelming relief. But Caligula's impact on history extends far beyond his brief reign. His madness demonstrated how quickly a stable government could collapse when led by someone disconnected from reality. It showed that even the mighty Roman Empire was vulnerable to the whims of a single delusional individual. The precedent he set of absolute power combined with complete mental instability would haunt Rome for generations. More importantly, Caligula's story reveals a disturbing truth about human nature. The same people who cheered his rise to power stood by and watched as he committed increasingly horrific acts. They were so desperate for entertainment and stability that they enabled his madness until it became too dangerous to ignore. His horse lived in luxury while Roman citizens starved, yet it took years for anyone to act. The question that haunts historians is simple. How many more Caligulas are waiting in the wings of power, their madness hidden behind smiles and promises? And when the next one appears, will we recognize the warning signs before it's too late? They say Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but the truth is far more disturbing than any legend. Nero didn't just watch his empire's capital city go up in flames. According to many historians, he was the one who lit the match. And his reasons had nothing to do with politics or war. They had everything to do with art. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus came to power in 54 AD, when he was just 16 years old. Unlike Caligula's immediate descent into madness, Nero's transformation was slower, more insidious. He began his reign with promise, guided by his advisor Seneca and his mother, Agrippina. But as the years passed, something dark began to emerge from behind his carefully crafted public image. Nero saw himself as an artist first and an emperor second. This might seem harmless, even admirable. But when the most powerful person in the world becomes obsessed with creative pursuits while ignoring the responsibilities of leadership, the results can be catastrophic. Nero didn't just want to be remembered as a great ruler. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived. His obsession began with poetry and music. He would spend days composing verses and learning to play the lyre, while matters of state piled up on his desk. He forced senators and foreign dignitaries to sit through hours-long poetry readings where they were required to applaud enthusiastically or face execution. Imagine the most powerful politicians in the world, men who controlled vast armies and territories, sitting like schoolchildren as a delusional emperor recited amateur poetry, their lives hanging on how convincingly they could fake appreciation. But Nero's artistic delusions went far beyond bad poetry. He genuinely believed he was destined to be the greatest performer in human history. He began entering competitions throughout Greece, always winning, not because of his talent, but because judges were too terrified to vote against him. He won chariot races where he fell out of his chariot and never finished the course. He won singing contests where his voice cracked and he forgot the words. Victory after victory was handed to him by judges who valued their lives more than their integrity. The turning point came when Nero decided that Rome itself wasn't worthy of his artistic vision. He looked at the chaotic, ancient streets and cramped buildings and saw them as obstacles to his creative genius. He began drawing up plans for a new Rome, a perfect, beautiful city that would serve as the ultimate backdrop for his performances. But there was one problem. The old Rome was in the way. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus. What started as a small blaze quickly spread through the narrow streets, fanned by strong winds. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burned. When the flames finally died down, 10 of the city's 14 districts lay in ruins. hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. The heart of the greatest empire on Earth had been reduced to ash and rubble. The official story was that the fire was an accident, but witnesses told a different tale. They reported seeing groups of men with torches systematically setting buildings ablaze and preventing firefighting efforts. When citizens tried to organize bucket brigades, these mysterious arsonists drove them away with clubs and swords. Most disturbing of all, several witnesses claimed they recognized some of these men as members of Nero's personal guard. But the most damning evidence came from Nero himself. While his city burned and his people fled in terror, the emperor was spotted on the Tower of Maecenas, playing his lyre and singing. Witnesses later testified that he was performing his own composition, an epic poem about the burning of Troy. As real flames destroyed real lives before his eyes, Nero saw only artistic inspiration. When confronted about his behavior, Nero's response revealed the depth of his delusion. He claimed he had been composing a masterpiece inspired by the destruction, comparing the burning of Rome to the greatest tragedies in literature. In his mind, the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people was simply material for his art. The death and displacement meant nothing compared to the beauty of his creative vision. The fire gave Nero exactly what he wanted, a blank canvas. In the ruins of Rome, he began construction of the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a massive palace complex that covered nearly a third of the city. This wasn't just a residence. It was Nero's vision of the perfect artistic environment. The main dining room had a rotating ceiling that mimicked the movement of the heavens. Walls were covered in gold leaf and precious gems. Gardens featured artificial lakes and forests filled with exotic animals. The most shocking feature was a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself, depicted as the sun god's soul. This colossus dominated the Roman skyline, visible from miles away, a constant reminder of the emperor's delusion that he was divine. While ordinary Romans lived in temporary shelters and struggled to rebuild their lives, they could look up and see their emperor's golden face gleaming in the sunlight. But Nero's artistic madness reached its peak with his public performances. He announced a series of theatrical shows where he would demonstrate his talents to the people of Rome. These weren't optional entertainment. Attendance was mandatory for all citizens. Doors to the theater were locked during performances to prevent anyone from leaving. Guards were stationed throughout the audience to watch for signs of boredom or disapproval. The performances themselves were exhibitions of pure delusion. Nero would take the stage dressed as various mythological figures, believing he was giving transcendent artistic experiences to his captive audience. He played Oedipus, Hercules, and even female roles like Candace and Antigone. The sight of the Roman emperor, the most powerful man on earth, prancing around in women's clothing while singing off-key love ballads, would have been comical if the consequences for laughing weren't death. During one particularly disturbing performance, Nero played Orestes, a character who kills his mother. As he acted out the matricide scene, members of the audience who knew about Nero's real relationship with his mother Agrippina shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 3 years earlier, Nero had arranged for his mother's assassination, and everyone suspected the truth. Watching him gleefully reenact a mother's murder felt less like art and more like confession. The most horrifying aspect of these performances was Nero's genuine belief in his own talent. After each show, he would demand reviews from prominent citizens, expecting detailed praise for his artistic genius. When a senator named Thrasea refused to attend one performance, Nero had him executed for treason. In Nero's mind, refusing to watch his art was equivalent to rebellion against the state. His delusions extended beyond performance into his daily life. He began wearing theatrical costumes instead of imperial robes, claiming the traditional imperial dress stifled his creativity. He insisted on being addressed with titles related to his artistic achievements rather than his political position. Foreign ambassadors found themselves negotiating treaties with an emperor who introduced himself as Nero, greatest of artists, rather than Caesar. The breaking point came when Nero announced his plans for a grand tour of Greece, where he intended to compete in every major artistic festival. He would be away from Rome for over a year, abandoning his duties as emperor to pursue his fantasy of being a traveling performer. While rebellions brewed in distant provinces and economic problems mounted at home, the emperor was planning his next singing competition. The Roman elite had endured years of madness, but this was too much. A conspiracy formed, led by senators and military commanders who could no longer tolerate being governed by a delusional performer. The plot was discovered, leading to a wave of executions that further destabilized the government. Trust between the emperor and his advisors completely broke down. In 68 AD, military rebellions erupted across the empire. Governors in Gaul, Spain, and Africa declared independence, no longer willing to serve an emperor who cared more about his art reviews than his armies. When news reached Rome that the legions were marching on the capital, Nero's first concern wasn't military strategy or political negotiations. It was who would perform his unfinished compositions after he was gone. Faced with inevitable capture and execution, Nero chose suicide, but even his final moments revealed his twisted priorities. As he prepared to take his own life, his last words were reportedly, "What an artist perishes in me." Not a thought for his empire, his people, or the lives destroyed by his madness. Only grief for the loss of what he saw as the greatest artistic talent in history. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into a civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. The empire that had taken centuries to build nearly collapsed in a single year, all because one man's artistic delusions had taken precedence over his responsibilities to reality. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Nero's story is how his madness was enabled by those around him. Senators, advisors, and citizens all played along with his fantasies because it seemed safer than confronting the truth. They applauded his terrible performances, praised his awful poetry, and validated his delusions because they feared the consequences of honesty. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Madness in power, protected by those too afraid to speak the truth. And each time, the cost would be measured not in hurt feelings or bruised egos, but in cities burned, lives lost, and civilizations pushed to the brink of collapse. Imagine forgetting your own name, your family, your entire identity, and you're the king of one of Europe's most powerful nations. This was the reality for Charles VI of France, a ruler whose descent into madness would spark a century of war and reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe forever. Charles VI began his reign in 1380 at the age of 12, initially ruling under the guidance of regents. For the first 12 years of his rule, he showed promise as a competent monarch. He was intelligent, physically impressive, and seemed destined to restore French glory after decades of conflict with England. The people called him Charles the Beloved, a title that would become heartbreakingly ironic as his mind began to fracture. The first signs of madness appeared in 1392, when Charles was 24 years old. He was leading a military expedition to Brittany when something inside his mind simply snapped. According to witnesses, the king suddenly stopped his horse in the middle of a forest road, drew his sword, and began attacking his own companions, screaming that enemies surrounded him. He killed 4 men before his guards could restrain him, all while his eyes showed no recognition of the people he had known for years. When the episode ended, Charles collapsed into unconsciousness. When he awoke hours later, he had no memory of what had happened. He looked around at the bodies of his own men with genuine confusion and horror, unable to understand why they were dead or why his sword was bloody. This wasn't just a moment of anger or stress. This was a complete break from reality that would define the rest of his life. The episodes came without warning and followed a terrifying pattern. Charles would suddenly forget who he was, where he was, and everyone around him. During these periods, which could last for months, he didn't recognize his own wife, his children, or his closest advisors. He would wander the halls of his palace like a ghost, sometimes refusing to bathe or change clothes for weeks, convinced that his skin was made of glass and would shatter if touched. This glass delusion became one of the most disturbing aspects of his madness. Charles genuinely believed his body was constructed from fragile glass that would break if he moved too quickly or sat down too hard. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect himself from shattering and refused to let anyone touch him. Imagine the most powerful man in France, cowering in corners and shuffling carefully across rooms because he thought his body might explode into fragments at any moment. During his worst episodes, Charles didn't just forget he was king, he forgot he was human. He would howl like a wolf, running on all fours through the palace corridors. Servants found him eating raw meat with his hands, convinced he was a wild animal. Other times, he believed he was made of different materials entirely. Sometimes crystal, sometimes porcelain. Sometimes he insisted he was St. George and spent days trying to rescue imaginary damsels from invisible dragons. But the most heartbreaking aspect of his condition was how it affected his relationship with his family. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, watched the man she married disappear behind a wall of delusion and paranoia. During his lucid periods, Charles would sometimes recognize her, only to forget her completely hours later. Their children grew up with a father who alternated between loving recognition and complete indifference, never knowing which version of their parent they would encounter. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. Medieval kingship depended on the personal authority of the monarch. When that monarch couldn't recognize his own advisors or remember basic facts about his kingdom, the entire system began to collapse. Different factions within the French nobility saw opportunity in the king's weakness and began positioning themselves to fill the power vacuum. 2 main factions emerged: the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy. Both claimed to be acting in the king's best interests, but in reality, they were fighting for control of France while Charles wandered his palace in a delusional haze. The country that had been moving toward greater centralization under strong monarchs suddenly found itself fragmenting into competing power centers. The situation became even more complex when Charles had brief periods of lucidity. During these moments, he would remember his royal duties and try to reassert control. But his previous decisions made during episodes of madness had already set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. Treaties had been signed, appointments made, and military campaigns launched, all in his name, but without his understanding. when he recovered enough to realize what had been done. The shock often triggered new episodes of madness. One of the most tragic examples occurred during negotiations with England. While Charles was deep in a delusional episode, convinced he was a peasant farmer, his representatives signed away vast territories and agreed to humiliating terms. When Charles recovered months later and learned what had been done in his name, the psychological trauma sent him into one of his longest periods of madness yet. He spent nearly 2 years believing he was various historical figures, sometimes Julius Caesar, sometimes Charlemagne, never himself. The English, led by Henry V, quickly recognized the opportunity presented by French political chaos. They renewed their claims to the French throne and launched a new phase of what would become the 100 Years' War. The famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was fought while Charles VI was in one of his worst episodes, convinced he was made of glass and unable to participate in defending his own kingdom. Perhaps most disturbing was how Charles's condition was manipulated by those around him. Different noble factions would time their visits and requests to coincide with his various delusional states. If they needed him to sign a document giving away land, they might visit when he thought he was St. Louis and believed giving away earthly possessions was holy. If they needed military support, they might approach when he thought he was Alexander the Great and was eager for conquest. His wife Isabeau eventually gave up trying to maintain the pretense of a functioning marriage. She took lovers and began making political decisions independently, sometimes in direct opposition to what Charles had decided during his lucid moments. The royal family became a strange theater where everyone played roles designed to work around the king's ever-changing delusions. The children suffered most of all. The Dauphin, heir to the throne, grew up never knowing if his father would recognize him as a son or as a stranger. Some of Charles's children learned to play along with his delusions, pretending to be whoever he thought they were in the moment. Others simply avoided him entirely, finding the constant shifts between recognition and total indifference too painful to bear. Medical understanding of mental illness in medieval times was primitive at best. Court physicians tried everything from bloodletting to exorcism, believing Charles was possessed by demons or suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors. Some treatments may have made his condition worse, adding physical suffering to his mental anguish. The sight of the King of France being subjected to medieval psychiatric treatments became a source of both pity and political instability throughout Europe. The most chilling aspect of Charles VI's story is how his madness became normalized within the French political system. After years of dealing with his condition, nobles and administrators developed routines for working around his episodes. They learned to recognize the signs of an approaching attack and had contingency plans for everything, from military decisions to diplomatic negotiations. The government of France essentially learned to function with a king who might, at any moment, forget he was king. This normalization had profound consequences for the development of royal authority in France. Future kings would struggle to restore the absolute power that had been fragmented during Charles's reign. The nobility had learned they could rule without a functional monarch, and they weren't eager to give up that independence when his successors proved more competent. Charles VI's reign lasted 42 years, but he was truly present for perhaps half of that time. During his final years, his episodes became more frequent and more severe. He would sometimes go months without a single moment of clarity, living in a world of shifting delusions and imaginary threats. When he died in 1422, many saw it as a mercy not just for him, but for the entire kingdom that had been held hostage by his fractured mind. But his legacy lived on in the political chaos that engulfed France for decades after his death. The 100 Years. War continued, fueled partly by the power vacuum his madness had created. It would take the emergence of figures like Joan of Arc to begin restoring French unity. And even then, the scars left by decades of royal madness would take generations to heal. Charles VI's story serves as a stark reminder of how fragile political stability can be when it depends on the mental health of a single individual. In an age when kings were seen as chosen by God, the idea that the divine choice could be a man who forgot his own identity challenged the very foundations of medieval political thought. His madness didn't just affect him personally, it reshaped the destiny of nations and changed the course of European history forever. In the opulent halls of Constantinople, where purple silk and golden mosaics spoke of divine authority, a different kind of horror was unfolding. Emperor Justin II, ruler of the mighty Byzantine Empire, had begun to believe that demons lived inside his own courtiers, and his solution was to bite them until they bled, convinced that only his imperial teeth could drive the evil spirits away. Justin II came to power in 565 AD as the nephew and chosen successor of the great Emperor Justinian I. The Byzantine Empire was at its zenith, controlling vast territories from Italy to Egypt, from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia. Justin inherited not just an empire, but a legacy of greatness that seemed impossible to maintain. The pressure of living up to Justinian's achievements may have been the first crack in what would become a complete psychological collapse. For the first few years of his reign, Justin II appeared competent, even promising. He continued his uncle's policies of territorial expansion and administrative reform. But those close to the emperor began to notice troubling changes in his behavior. He became obsessed with conspiracies, convinced that enemies surrounded him at every turn. What started as reasonable paranoia for a powerful ruler gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The first documented episode of Justin's madness occurred during a routine court ceremony in 568 AD. As a group of senators approached to pay their respects, Justin suddenly screamed that he could see demons crawling across their faces. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward and bit one of the senators on the hand, drawing blood. When guards tried to restrain him, Justin explained calmly that the man had been possessed and that only imperial blood transferred through his bite could perform an exorcism. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following months, Justin's delusion that his bite could cure demonic possession became a central feature of his mental illness. Court sessions turned into nightmarish scenes where the emperor would suddenly pounce on unsuspecting officials, sinking his teeth into their arms, necks, or faces. He kept detailed records of who he had cured, believing he was performing sacred duties as God's representative on earth. The Byzantine court, accustomed to elaborate ceremonies and rigid protocol, struggled to adapt to their emperor's violent unpredictability. Courtiers began wearing thick clothing and arm guards, hoping to protect themselves from imperial teeth. Some started avoiding court altogether, claiming illness or urgent business in distant provinces. The great palace of Constantinople, once a symbol of order and divine authority, became a place where grown men lived in terror of being bitten by their own emperor. But Justin's madness manifested in other disturbing ways. He became convinced that he was not just the emperor of Byzantium, but the emperor of the entire world, past, present, and future. He would spend hours dictating letters to historical figures like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, expecting responses that never came. When informed that these men had been dead for centuries, Justin would fly into rages, accusing his advisors of hiding his mail and preventing him from communicating with his fellow emperors. His delusions of universal dominion led to increasingly erratic foreign policy decisions. Justin declared war on multiple neighboring kingdoms simultaneously, convinced that his divine authority meant automatic victory. He sent ambassadors to distant lands with impossible demands, expecting immediate submission to his imaginary global empire. When these diplomatic missions failed, he blamed demonic interference and launched into frenzied biting sprees, trying to exorcise the evil spirits he believed were sabotaging his reign. The most disturbing aspect of Justin's condition was how it affected his relationship with his wife, Empress Sophia. During his episodes, he would sometimes recognize her as his beloved spouse, but other times, he would see her as a dangerous shapeshifter sent by his enemies. On several occasions, he attempted to bite her as well, convinced that she had been replaced by a demon wearing her face. Sophia learned to carry a small dagger for protection and employed food tasters, not just to check for poison, but to ensure her husband wouldn't suddenly attack during meals. The administrative consequences of Justin's madness were catastrophic. The Byzantine Empire depended on complex bureaucratic systems and careful diplomatic relationships to maintain control over its diverse territories. When the emperor began making random decisions based on his delusions, the entire system started to break down. Provincial governors received contradictory orders, sometimes written in the same day during different phases of Justin's mental episodes. One particularly tragic example involved the empire's relationship with the Persian Empire. Justin, during a period when he believed he was the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, decided to conquer Persia single-handedly. He assembled a massive army and marched east, but his erratic behavior and bizarre battle plans led to devastating defeats. Thousands of Byzantine soldiers died because their emperor was fighting imaginary demons instead of real Persian warriors. The military disasters triggered rebellions throughout the empire. Provincial commanders receiving incomprehensible orders from an emperor who claimed to be battling supernatural forces began making independent decisions. Some territories effectively became autonomous, while others fell to enemy invasions. The Great Byzantine Empire, which had survived barbarian invasions and religious conflicts, found itself fragmenting because its leader couldn't distinguish between reality and delusion. Perhaps most heartbreaking was how Justin's condition affected his moments of lucidity. Unlike some mad rulers who remained consistently delusional, Justin would sometimes recover enough to realize what he had been doing. The sight of bite marks on his courtiers' bodies, the reports of military disasters, and the evidence of governmental chaos would send him into periods of profound depression and self-loathing. These moments of clarity were often followed by even worse episodes, as if the knowledge of his own madness drove him deeper into insanity. The Byzantine court developed elaborate protocols to manage their emperor's condition. When signs of an impending episode appeared, which courtiers learned to recognize through subtle changes in Justin's speech and behavior, key officials would be quietly warned to stay away from the palace. Important documents were hidden, and foreign ambassadors were told the emperor was ill. The empire that prided itself on ceremonial grandeur began operating in shadows and whispers. Empress Sophia, gradually took over many imperial duties, ruling through a combination of official regency and informal influence. She proved to be a capable administrator, but her authority was always compromised by the fact that Justin might emerge from his episodes at any time and countermand her decisions. The result was a government that lurched between competent leadership and chaotic madness, sometimes changing direction multiple times in a single week. The most chilling aspect of Justin's reign was how his delusions became self-reinforcing. When courtiers started avoiding him, he saw this as proof that demons were spreading through his court. When military campaigns failed due to his erratic leadership, he blamed supernatural interference. When provinces rebelled, he interpreted this as evidence of a massive demonic conspiracy against his rule. Each consequence of his madness became, in his mind, validation of the very delusions that had caused the problems in the first place. Religious leaders struggled to understand and address the emperor's condition. Some saw it as divine punishment for unspecified sins, others as a test of the empire's faith. A few brave clerics suggested that Justin needed medical treatment rather than spiritual intervention, but they risked being accused of blasphemy for implying that God's chosen ruler could be mentally ill. The theological implications of a mad emperor challenged fundamental Byzantine beliefs about divine authority and imperial legitimacy. The end of Justin's effective reign came in 574 AD, when his condition deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function even during lucid periods. The constant stress of ruling while battling his own mind had taken a devastating physical toll. He would spend days hiding in his private chambers, emerging only to attack servants he believed were demons in disguise. Sophia officially took power as regent, though she had been the de facto ruler for years. Justin lingered for 4 more years, occasionally surfacing to issue bizarre proclamations or attack palace staff. When he finally died in 578 AD, the empire had survived his madness, but just barely. Territories had been lost, the military had been weakened, and the governmental system had been fundamentally altered by years of accommodating an emperor who thought his teeth were weapons against supernatural forces. The legacy of Justin II's madness extended far beyond his own reign. Future Byzantine emperors would face constant questions about their mental stability, and the empire developed new mechanisms for dealing with imperial incapacity. More importantly, Justin's story demonstrated how quickly a great civilization could be brought to the brink of collapse by the mental illness of a single individual, no matter how many safeguards and institutions surrounded that person. In the grand sweep of Byzantine history, Justin II is often forgotten, overshadowed by greater emperors before and after him. But his 12-year reign serves as a stark reminder that madness recognizes no boundaries of class, education, or divine authority. When the most powerful person in the world believes he can cure demons with his teeth, the consequences ripple through history in ways that can never be fully undone. The screams echoed through the halls of the Kremlin that November day in 1581. But they weren't screams of physical pain. They were the anguished cries of a father who had just realized he had murdered his own son in a fit of uncontrollable rage. Ivan IV of Russia, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, stood over the bloodied body of his heir, the iron-tipped staff still in his hand. His mind finally grasping the magnitude of what his madness had driven him to do. But this wasn't the beginning of Ivan's descent into madness. It was merely the most horrific culmination of a lifetime of psychological deterioration that had already transformed one of Russia's most promising rulers into a monster who terrorized his own people for decades. Ivan Vasilievich became Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3 when his father died in 1533. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, served as regent until her mysterious death when Ivan was 8, a death that many suspected was poison. From that moment forward, young Ivan was surrounded by boyars, powerful nobles who fought viciously among themselves for control of Russia, while treating the child Tsar as little more than a political pawn. The traumatic experiences of Ivan's childhood would shape his adult paranoia and violence in ways that historians are still trying to understand. He witnessed brutal executions, political assassinations, and constant betrayal. By the age of 13, he had already ordered his first execution, that of Andrei Shuisky, a boyar who had humiliated him. Ivan watched as his victim was torn apart by dogs, a scene that should have horrified a normal child, but instead seemed to excite him. When Ivan was crowned Tsar of all Russia in 1547, at age 16, he seemed to have overcome his troubled childhood. He implemented important reforms, expanded Russian territory, and showed promise as an enlightened ruler. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a union that brought him genuine happiness and seemed to stabilize his volatile personality. For 13 years, Ivan ruled with relative wisdom and restraint. But in 1560, Anastasia died suddenly, and with her death, whatever anchor had kept Ivan tethered to sanity was cut loose forever. He became convinced that his wife had been poisoned by the boyars, the same nobles who had tormented his childhood. Whether this belief was based on evidence or paranoid delusion, it triggered a transformation that would make Ivan one of history's most feared tyrants. The change was immediate and terrifying. Ivan began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that vast conspiracies surrounded him at every moment. He started carrying an iron-tipped staff wherever he went, using it to strike down anyone who displeased him, from servants who moved too slowly to nobles who looked at him the wrong way. The halls of the Kremlin became a battleground where courtiers lived in constant fear of their Tsar's unpredictable violence. But Ivan's madness went beyond simple paranoia. He developed elaborate torture methods that he would personally oversee, taking genuine pleasure in the suffering of his victims. He created the Oprichniki, a secret police force of 6,000 men dressed in black, who rode black horses and carried symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing their mission to bite and sweep away the Tsar's enemies. These men were given unlimited authority to arrest, torture, and execute anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty. The Oprichniki's reign of terror lasted 7 years and turned Russia into a nightmare state where no one was safe. Entire families were executed for the crimes of single members. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and thrown to wild animals. Priests were burned alive in their own churches. Ivan would often attend these executions personally, sometimes participating in the torture while claiming he was doing God's work by purging Russia of traitors. One of the most horrific examples of Ivan's madness occurred in the city of Novgorod in 1570. Convinced that the city was planning to defect to Lithuania, Ivan marched there with his Oprichniki and unleashed 5 weeks of unprecedented brutality. Thousands of men, women, and children were tortured and killed. The city's archbishop was sewn into a bearskin and hunted by dogs for Ivan's entertainment. Bodies were thrown into the river in such numbers that the water ran red for miles downstream. But what made Ivan's cruelty especially disturbing was his religious justification for it. He genuinely believed that his violent actions were divinely inspired, that God was speaking directly through him to cleanse Russia of corruption. After particularly brutal torture sessions, he would retreat to his private chapel and pray for hours, thanking God for allowing him to serve as an instrument of divine justice. This combination of extreme violence and religious ecstasy created a feedback loop that reinforced his worst impulses. Ivan's madness also manifested in bizarre sexual obsessions. He married 7 times, far exceeding the Orthodox Church's limit of 3 marriages. When church leaders protested, he had them tortured until they agreed to perform the ceremonies. He kept detailed records of his sexual conquests, which numbered in the hundreds, and would force noble families to provide their daughters for his pleasure. Those who refused faced execution, while those who complied often found their daughters returned broken or dead. The psychological toll on Ivan's own family was devastating. His children grew up in an atmosphere of constant terror, never knowing when their father's affection might transform into murderous rage. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, developed into a capable young man, despite his father's madness. But he lived in constant fear of triggering one of the Tsar's violent episodes. The relationship between Ivan and his son became increasingly strained as the young man grew older and began to question his father's methods. Ivan Ivanovich tried to moderate his father's policies and protect innocent people from the oprichniki's brutality. He married without his father's permission, an act of defiance that infuriated Ivan the Terrible. The stage was set for the ultimate tragedy. On November 16, 1581, Ivan entered his son's chambers in a rage, possibly triggered by seeing his daughter-in-law in clothing he deemed inappropriate. The exact details of what happened next vary in different accounts, but the outcome was the same. In a fit of uncontrollable fury, Ivan struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. The moment Ivan realized what he had done, his madness seemed to lift temporarily, replaced by a grief so profound that witnesses said it was worse than watching the initial violence. He cradled his dying son's head in his lap, begging for forgiveness, promising to abdicate and become a monk. But it was too late. The heir to the Russian throne died in his father's arms, a victim of the same madness that had terrorized Russia for over 2 decades. The death of his son broke something in Ivan that his previous victims' deaths had not. He fell into a deep depression, spending hours staring at the bloodstain where his son had. He began talking to himself constantly, sometimes carrying on conversations with his dead son, sometimes with his dead wife, Anastasia. Courtiers reported that he would sometimes laugh hysterically while looking at nothing, then suddenly burst into tears and beg invisible figures for forgiveness. But even in his grief, Ivan's madness continued to claim victims. He became convinced that his son's death was part of a larger conspiracy, that enemies had somehow manipulated him into committing the murder. He launched new waves of executions, targeting anyone who had been present in the palace that day. The Oprichniki, who had already devastated much of Russia, received new orders to root out the imaginary conspiracy that had caused the Tsar to kill his heir. The final years of Ivan's reign were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. He surrounded himself with astrologers and mystics, desperately seeking supernatural explanations for his son's death and his own behavior. He claimed to receive visions from saints and angels, all of whom allegedly told him that his violence had been necessary and justified. These religious delusions provided him with the psychological framework to avoid confronting the reality of what he had become. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, he left behind a Russia that had been fundamentally transformed by his madness. The population had been decimated, the economy was in ruins, and the political system was in chaos. Most tragically, he had eliminated his own succession by killing his most capable heir, leaving the throne to his weak and incompetent younger son, Fyodor I. The long-term consequences of Ivan's madness extended far beyond his own lifetime. The instability he created led directly to the time of troubles, a period of civil war and foreign invasion that nearly destroyed the Russian state. It took the emergence of the Romanov dynasty in 1613 to restore stability. But the scars left by Ivan's reign influenced Russian political culture for centuries. Ivan the Terrible's story reveals how madness in a ruler doesn't just affect individuals, it can reshape entire civilizations. His paranoid delusions created institutions of oppression that outlasted his reign. His religious justifications for violence established precedents that future tyrants would exploit. Most importantly, his murder of his own son demonstrated that when madness grips absolute power, not even the bonds of family can provide protection. The image of Ivan cradling his dying son while begging for forgiveness has become one of the most powerful symbols of how unchecked power, combined with mental illness, can destroy everything it touches, including the very thing the mad ruler claims to protect. In Ivan's case, his obsession with securing his dynasty through violence ultimately destroyed that dynasty entirely, leaving Russia to pay the price for his madness for generations to come. The king has gone mad. The king has gone mad. The whispered words spread through the corridors of Windsor Castle like wildfire in the winter of 1788. King George III, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, was found talking to trees in his garden, convinced they were foreign ambassadors. But this wasn't just the beginning of his madness. It was the public revelation of a condition that had already cost Britain its American colonies and would reshape the British monarchy forever. George William Frederick became King George III in 1760 at the age of 22, inheriting a global empire that stretched from the Caribbean to India. For the first 15 years of his reign, he appeared to be a competent, if stubborn, monarch. He was deeply religious, faithful to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and committed to what he saw as his royal duties. But beneath this facade of stability, something was already beginning to crack. The first signs of George's mental instability appeared during the growing crisis with the American colonies in the 1760s and 1770s. What seemed like political stubbornness to his contemporaries may actually have been early symptoms of his condition. His obsessive fixation on maintaining British control over America, his inability to consider compromise, and his increasingly erratic decision-making all suggest that his madness was already influencing policy long before anyone recognized it as illness. The American colonists' complaints about taxation without representation struck George not as legitimate political grievances, but as personal betrayals by ungrateful children. He took colonial resistance as a direct insult to his authority and person, responding with a rigidity that puzzled even his own ministers. When advised to consider concessions that might prevent war, George would fly into rages, insisting that any compromise would be a sign of weakness that would encourage rebellion throughout the empire. Modern historians debate whether George's mental condition influenced his handling of the American crisis, but the pattern of his decision-making suggests it did. He showed classic symptoms of what we now recognize as bipolar disorder, periods of manic energy where he would work for days without sleep, followed by crashes into depression and paranoia. During manic phases, He would dictate dozens of letters in a single night, often contradicting instructions he had given hours earlier. His ministers learned to delay implementing his orders, hoping he would change his mind when his mood shifted. The American Revolution became George's personal obsession in ways that went far beyond normal royal concern for political affairs. He would pace his chambers for hours, muttering about ungrateful colonists and treacherous rebels. He began to see the conflict not as a political dispute, but as a cosmic battle between good and evil, with himself as God's chosen instrument for restoring order. This grandiose thinking, typical of manic episodes, made compromise impossible and prolonged a war that more pragmatic leadership might have ended much sooner. When news of British defeats reached London, George's reactions were extreme and unpredictable. Sometimes he would rage for hours, throwing furniture and threatening to personally lead armies to America. Other times, he would sink into profound depression, refusing to meet with ministers or conduct any royal business. His wife, Queen Charlotte, began to notice disturbing changes in his behavior. He would talk rapidly for hours about subjects that made no sense, then suddenly fall silent for days. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 triggered what appears to have been George's first major psychotic episode, though it was kept secret from the public. Palace insiders later reported that the king spent weeks believing he was still fighting the Revolutionary War, issuing orders to generals who were no longer in service and planning battles for territories Britain no longer controlled. He would study maps obsessively, moving toy soldiers around to represent troop movements in campaigns that existed only in his imagination. But it was in 1788 that George's madness could no longer be hidden from the world. The episode began gradually, with increased talkativeness and inappropriate behavior during court functions. He would interrupt diplomatic meetings with long speeches about agriculture or astronomy, subjects that fascinated him during manic periods. Foreign ambassadors sent worried reports back to their governments about the British king's strange conduct. The situation escalated rapidly in October 1788. George began experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as acute mania combined with psychotic symptoms. He would talk for hours without stopping, jumping from topic to topic in ways that made no logical sense. His speech became so rapid and disjointed that courtiers couldn't follow his meaning. He stopped sleeping, roaming the palace halls at all hours, sometimes nearly naked, engaging in conversations with furniture and portraits. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred when George became convinced that Lady Pembroke, one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, was actually his wife. He pursued the terrified woman through the palace corridors, trying to embrace her, while Queen Charlotte watched in horror. When restraint was attempted, George's strength became superhuman, requiring multiple men to control him. The sight of the King of England being physically restrained while raving incoherently was so shocking that those who witnessed it were sworn to secrecy. The famous tree incident that gave this episode its popular notoriety occurred in December 1788. George was found in the palace gardens during a snowstorm, dressed only in his nightclothes, bowing formally to an oak tree and conducting what he believed was a diplomatic negotiation with the King of Prussia. He spoke to the tree for over an hour, discussing trade agreements and military alliances, occasionally pausing to listen to responses that only he could hear. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of George's condition was how it affected his relationship with his family. Queen Charlotte, who had been his devoted companion for over 20 years, found herself married to a stranger who sometimes didn't recognize her, and other times treated her as an enemy spy. Their children, ranging from adults to young teenagers, watched their father transform from a loving parent into someone who terrified them with his unpredictable behavior. The political crisis created by the king's madness was unprecedented in British history. The Constitution provided no clear mechanism for dealing with a monarch who was alive but completely unable to function. George's eldest son, the future George IV, maneuvered to become regent, but this required Parliament to officially declare the king insane, a step that many found politically and morally troubling. The Regency crisis revealed deep fault lines in British politics and society. Some saw the king's madness as divine punishment for the loss of America or for moral failings in the royal family. Others viewed it as proof that the monarchy was an obsolete institution that should be abolished. Religious leaders debated whether madness was a spiritual condition that required exorcism or a medical problem that needed treatment. The medical treatment George received was primitive and often cruel, even by 18th century standards. The most famous of his doctors, Francis Willis, used methods that included straitjackets, cold baths, and mechanical restraint chairs. Willis believed that madness was a failure of will that could be cured by breaking the patient's spirit through fear and discomfort. George was strapped into a chair for hours at a time, sometimes with a gag in his mouth to prevent his constant talking. The mad shirt became one of the most infamous instruments used on George, a canvas straitjacket that pinned his arms to his body. Contemporary accounts describe the king struggling against these restraints while reciting Shakespeare or singing hymns, his voice echoing through the palace corridors. The image of the ruler of a global empire reduced to such a state shocked those who witnessed it and challenged fundamental beliefs about royal authority and divine right. Remarkably, George recovered from this episode in early 1789, just as spontaneously as it had begun. One morning, he woke up lucid, recognizing his family and remembering his royal duties. The speed of his recovery was almost as disturbing as his illness had been, raising questions about the nature of madness that doctors couldn't answer. How could someone be completely insane one day and apparently normal the next? The king's recovery was celebrated throughout Britain with public festivities and church services of thanksgiving. But those close to George knew that he was not the same man who had fallen ill. He had gained insight into his condition that was both blessing and curse. He remembered enough of his episodes to be terrified of future ones. He began to monitor his own behavior obsessively, constantly worried that he was slipping back into madness. George's awareness of his own mental fragility made him increasingly dependent on routine and ritual. He developed elaborate daily schedules that he followed religiously, believing that any deviation might trigger another episode. His conversations became stilted and careful, as if he was constantly editing himself to avoid saying anything that might indicate returning illness. The spontaneous, sometimes charming king of earlier years was replaced by a man who seemed to be holding himself together through sheer force of will. The political consequences of the king's madness extended far beyond the Regency crisis. It fundamentally changed how the British monarchy operated, accelerating the transition toward a more ceremonial role for the crown. Ministers who had worked around George's illness developed new methods of governance that relied less on royal input, creating precedents that would shape the modern constitutional monarchy. George experienced several more episodes of madness over the next 2 decades, each one carefully concealed from the public, but increasingly severe. By 1810, the death of his beloved daughter Amelia triggered a final descent into permanent madness from which he never recovered. He spent his last 10 years in almost complete isolation at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and lost in a world of delusions that no one else could enter. When George III finally died in 1820, he had been effectively absent from his throne for a decade. But his legacy was profound and lasting. His madness had contributed to the loss of the American colonies, reshaped the British political system, and changed public understanding of mental illness. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that even divine right and absolute power were no protection against the fragility of the human mind. The tragedy of George III lies not just in his personal suffering, but in how his condition affected millions of people across the British Empire. His inability to govern rationally during the American crisis helped create the United States. His episodes of madness destabilized British politics for decades. His story serves as a powerful reminder that when madness afflicts those in power, the consequences extend far beyond the individual sufferer, rippling through history in ways that can never be fully calculated or undone. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Claudius, the stammering, limping, drooling member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, whom everyone dismissed as an idiot, turned out to be the sanest emperor Rome had seen in decades. But his story reveals something even more disturbing about power and madness. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from those who are obviously insane, but from those whose madness is so subtle that it masquerades as wisdom. Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus lived his first 50 years as the embarrassment of the imperial family. Born with what modern doctors believe was cerebral palsy, he walked with a limp, had an uncontrollable head tremor, and drooled when he spoke. His own mother, Antonia, called him a monster of a man, not finished by nature. His nephew Caligula kept him around as court entertainment, forcing him to perform humiliating tricks for the amusement of dinner guests. But this apparent weakness became Claudius's salvation. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD and the Praetorian Guard was hunting down potential heirs to prevent civil war, they found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace. The soldiers initially planned to kill him too, but then realized that this stammering, trembling man might be exactly what Rome needed, a puppet emperor they could control, while the real power remained with the military and Senate. They were catastrophically wrong. The moment Claudius became emperor, something remarkable happened. The stammering decreased, his posture straightened, and behind those watery eyes, a sharp intelligence began to emerge. For the first time in his life, Claudius had found something he was genuinely good at: ruling an empire. But power, even when wielded competently, has its own form of madness. Claudius's reign began with what appeared to be rational reforms. He expanded the empire sensibly, adding Britain to Roman territory through a well-planned invasion. He improved the legal system, built aqueducts and roads, and generally seemed to restore sanity to Roman government after the chaos of Caligula's rule. But beneath this competent surface, Claudius was developing an obsession that would eventually consume him entirely. The obsession with being remembered as the greatest emperor in Roman history. This might seem like normal ambition, but in Claudius's case, it became something pathological. He began rewriting history to enhance his own role, commissioning fake documents that proved his family's greater importance in past events. He forced scholars to include fabricated stories about his ancestors in their works, threatening exile or death for those who refused. Most disturbing of all, he started to believe these fabrications himself, until he could no longer distinguish between the real history and the version he had created. Claudius's obsession with historical legacy led to increasingly bizarre behavior. He would spend days at a time in the imperial library, dictating corrections to historical texts that had been written centuries before he was born. He claimed to have discovered new evidence about long-dead emperors, always evidence that somehow made his own reign seem more significant by comparison. When historians pointed out obvious anachronisms in his revisions, he would have them arrested for questioning imperial authority. But Claudius's historical revisionism was just the beginning of his descent into a subtler form of madness. Unlike the obvious insanity of Caligula or Nero, Claudius's condition manifested as an extreme form of paranoid intellectualism. He became convinced that he was surrounded by people too stupid to understand his superior intelligence, and that only he could see the hidden patterns that governed the empire. This paranoid intellectualism led to the creation of a vast spy network that made Caligula's paranoia look amateur by comparison. Claudius recruited informants from every level of Roman society, from senators to slaves, all reporting directly to him about potential threats to his reign. But unlike normal imperial intelligence gathering, Claudius's spies were instructed to look for intellectual threats, people who might be smart enough to challenge his version of history or question his interpretation of events. The result was a reign of terror, targeting not political dissidents, but intellectuals, historians, and anyone who showed signs of independent thinking. Teachers were arrested for using textbooks that contradicted Claudius's revised history. Philosophers were exiled for asking questions about the nature of imperial authority. Even mathematicians were suspected of using their skills to code secret messages, criticizing the emperor. Claudius's paranoid intellectualism reached its peak with his treatment of his own family. He became convinced that his wives and children were plotting against him, not through normal political means, but by subtly undermining his intellectual authority. He would test them constantly, asking trick questions about history or philosophy, then interpreting wrong answers as evidence of treason. His third wife, Valeria Messalina, became the primary target of his intellectual paranoia. Messalina was known for her wild behavior and numerous affairs. But Claudius interpreted her sexual escapades as elaborate intellectual conspiracies. He became convinced that she was seducing senators and generals, not for pleasure, but to gather information that could be used to make him look foolish. When she married another man, while still wed to Claudius, he saw it not as adultery, but as an attempt to create competing claims to historical legitimacy. The execution of Messalina in 48 AD revealed the true depth of Claudius's madness. Rather than simply having her killed for adultery or treason, he subjected her to an elaborate interrogation designed to uncover her intellectual crimes. He wanted confessions not just about her affairs, but about her alleged attempts to undermine his historical research and question his scholarship. When she couldn't provide the confessions he wanted, because the crimes existed only in his imagination, he had her tortured until she died. Claudius's fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, initially seemed to understand how to manage his paranoid intellectualism. She praised his historical work, agreed with his revised versions of events, and appeared to share his contempt for the intellectual limitations of others. But she made one fatal mistake. She was too intelligent for her own good, and Claudius eventually became suspicious of her intelligence itself. This intellectual paranoia extended to Claudius's treatment of his stepson, Nero. Rather than seeing Nero's obvious character flaws and growing instability, Claudius became obsessed with the young man's intelligence. He interpreted Nero's artistic interests as signs of dangerous intellectualism and spent years trying to determine whether his stepson was smart enough to pose a threat to his legacy. The irony is that while Claudius was obsessing over imaginary intellectual threats, he completely missed the real danger growing right under his nose. Agrippina wasn't plotting against him because she disagreed with his historical theories. She was planning to poison him so her son could become emperor. Claudius's paranoid intellectualism had made him blind to ordinary political ambition, the very thing that would ultimately destroy him. When Agrippina finally did poison Claudius in 54 AD, using a doctored plate of his favorite mushrooms, his last words reportedly concerned not his empire or his family, but his unfinished historical manuscripts. Even as he died, he was worried about who would continue his work of revising Roman history to enhance his own reputation. The tragedy of Claudius lies in how his particular form of madness actually made him a more effective ruler in the short term, while ultimately ensuring his destruction. His paranoid intellectualism drove him to micromanage every aspect of government, which prevented the kind of chaos that had marked previous reigns. But it also made him incapable of recognizing real threats while obsessing over imaginary ones. Claudius's reign demonstrates that madness in rulers isn't always obvious or dramatic. Sometimes the most dangerous delusions are those that appear rational on the surface, but are driven by fundamentally distorted thinking. His obsession with intellectual control was just as destructive as Caligula's belief that he was a god, but it was much harder for contemporaries to recognize and address. The long-term consequences of Claudius's subtle madness were profound. By eliminating so many genuine intellectuals and replacing them with yes-men who supported his fictional version of history, he weakened the very institutions that might have prevented future imperial disasters. When Nero came to power, he inherited a government staffed with people selected not for competence, but for their willingness to agree with obviously false historical claims. More importantly, Claudius established a precedent for intellectual authoritarianism that would influence Roman culture for centuries. The idea that political authority extended to controlling not just actions, but thoughts and interpretations became embedded in imperial ideology. Future emperors would use similar methods to suppress not just political dissent, but intellectual independence itself. Claudius's story serves as a warning about a particularly insidious form of madness in power, the delusion that intelligence and paranoia are the same thing. His reign shows how a ruler's obsession with being seen as intellectually superior can be just as destructive as more obvious forms of insanity, and perhaps more dangerous because it's so much harder to recognize and resist. In the end, the emperor who started his reign as the sanest man in Rome became something far more dangerous than his obviously mad predecessors. A tyrant who used his intelligence to justify and implement his delusions, creating a system of oppression that was both more subtle and more comprehensive than anything Caligula could have imagined. The dinner guests tried not to look at the forest of steaks surrounding the banquet table, each one crowned with a slowly rotting corpse. But their host, Vlad III of Wallachia, seemed to find the display charming. He raised his goblet of wine in a toast to the impaled bodies, commenting cheerfully on how the decomposition process was proceeding, and asking his horrified visitors if they didn't think the arrangement created a lovely ambiance for their meal. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. This was madness masquerading as statecraft, a ruler so disconnected from normal human emotion that he genuinely believed impaling thousands of people was not only acceptable, but artistically beautiful. Vlad the Impaler's story reveals how madness can hide behind a facade of political necessity, making even the most horrific acts seem reasonable to those desperate enough to follow a strong leader. Vlad III Dracula became ruler of Wallachia in 1448, inheriting a small principality caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. His childhood had been spent as a hostage in the Ottoman court, where he witnessed firsthand the sophisticated torture methods that would later inspire his own innovations. But what turned a traumatized child into history's most creative monster was something deeper than learned behavior. It was a fundamental inability to see other human beings as anything more than objects for his amusement. The first signs of Vlad's madness appeared during his initial brief reign as a teenager. While most young rulers rely on advisors and established protocols, Vlad immediately began experimenting with new forms of punishment that went far beyond anything his predecessors had used. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the mechanics of human suffering, approaching torture with the same systematic curiosity that other people might bring to studying mathematics or astronomy. When Vlad regained power in 1456, after years in exile, his madness had fully matured. He returned not as a traditional medieval prince focused on territory and wealth, but as something resembling a serial killer with an army. His first act was to invite all the boyars, the noble families who had betrayed his father, to an Easter feast. As they ate and drank, Vlad calmly explained that they would all be impaled before sunset. Not for political reasons, but because he was curious to see how different people would react to the same form of execution. The impalement itself revealed the depth of Vlad's psychological disorder. He didn't simply execute his enemies. He turned their deaths into elaborate performances for his own entertainment. He would personally supervise the positioning of each stake, adjusting angles and heights to create what he called aesthetic compositions. Sometimes he would arrange impaled bodies to tell stories, positioning them to suggest narrative scenes or emotional relationships between the victims. But what made Vlad's behavior especially disturbing was his genuine belief that he was creating art. He would invite foreign diplomats and local merchants to view his displays, pointing out particular arrangements he was proud of and explaining the symbolism he had embedded in different compositions. He spoke about his impaled victims the way other rulers might discuss paintings or sculptures, as objects of beauty that demonstrated his creative vision. This artistic approach to mass murder reached its horrifying peak during his campaign against Ottoman merchants in 1459. Rather than simply killing traders who violated his economic policies, Vlad created an entire gallery of impaled bodies arranged to tell the story of his principality's struggle for independence. Visitors were given guided tours, with Vlad personally explaining how each display represented different aspects of his political philosophy. The most chilling aspect of these exhibitions was Vlad's genuine expectation that others would share his aesthetic appreciation. He became angry when visitors failed to praise his arrangements or seemed uncomfortable viewing his work. Foreign ambassadors learned to feign admiration for his displays, knowing that insufficient enthusiasm for his art could result in becoming part of it themselves. Vlad's madness wasn't limited to impalement. He developed an extensive repertoire of torture methods. each one carefully designed, not just to cause pain, but to create what he considered beautiful visual effects. He would burn people alive in arrangements that resembled flower gardens, with victims positioned to suggest different types of blooms. He created musical executions where victims' screams were orchestrated to produce specific sounds at predetermined intervals. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts suggests that Vlad suffered from a complete absence of empathy combined with an aesthetic sensibility that found beauty in suffering. This wasn't the rage-driven violence of someone like Ivan the Terrible, nor the delusional grandeur of Caligula. This was the methodical creativity of someone who genuinely couldn't understand why others found his work disturbing. One of the most revealing incidents occurred when Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming religious obligations prevented them from doing so. Rather than simply executing them for disrespect, Vlad decided to help them keep their turbans on permanently by having the headwear nailed to their skulls. He seemed genuinely puzzled when other diplomats found this solution inappropriate, explaining that he was simply being accommodating to their religious needs. Vlad's treatment of his own people revealed the same disconnect from normal human emotion. When merchants complained about Turkish raids affecting their trade, he solved the problem by impaling every Turkish prisoner he could find and arranging their bodies along major trade routes as a deterrent. When citizens petitioned for relief from excessive taxes, he impaled the petition bearers and displayed their bodies as a warning against future complaints. But perhaps most disturbing was how Vlad's madness infected those around him. His guards and soldiers, initially horrified by his methods, gradually became desensitized to extreme violence. Some even began suggesting new torture techniques, competing for their prince's approval by proposing increasingly creative methods of execution. The entire principality became a laboratory for human suffering, with normal people transformed into willing participants in systematic madness. Vlad's domestic life revealed the same terrifying disconnect from reality. He married twice, and both wives reportedly lived in constant terror, never knowing when their husband's artistic inspiration might turn toward them. He would test their loyalty by describing his latest torture innovations in intimate detail during dinner, watching their reactions carefully to ensure they showed appropriate appreciation for his creativity. His relationship with his own children was equally disturbing. Rather than normal parental affection, Vlad seemed to view his offspring as potential subjects for his experiments in human behavior. He would expose them to his torture sessions from a young age. He wrote to the Hungarian king about diplomatic relations, while describing in the same paragraph how he had arranged the impaled bodies of Ottoman prisoners to spell out words visible from miles away. What made Vlad especially dangerous was his complete inability to recognize that his behavior was abnormal. Unlike other mad rulers, who showed some awareness of their condition during lucid moments, Vlad remained consistently convinced that his methods were not only acceptable, but superior to conventional approaches. He genuinely believed that other rulers were simply too weak or unimaginative to appreciate the effectiveness of extreme torture as a tool of statecraft. This conviction led to increasingly grandiose displays designed to demonstrate his methods to the wider world. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia with a massive army, Vlad's response revealed the full extent of his madness. Rather than fleeing or negotiating, he created his masterpiece, a forest of 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners arranged in perfect geometric patterns outside the city of Targovishte. The sight was so horrifying that even the Sultan, a man accustomed to the brutalities of medieval warfare, reportedly turned back without engaging in battle. But Vlad interpreted this withdrawal not as revulsion at his cruelty, but as artistic triumph. He had created a work of such powerful beauty, he believed, that even his enemies were moved to admiration. In his mind, the retreat proved that his aesthetic approach to violence was superior to conventional military tactics. The final phase of Vlad's reign showed his madness reaching its ultimate expression. Cut off from external enemies by his reputation for extreme cruelty, he turned his artistic attention toward his own subjects. He began creating elaborate torture displays using ordinary citizens, claiming he was educating them about the consequences of disloyalty. Markets, churches, and public squares became galleries for his latest creations, with mandatory attendance for all citizens. But Vlad's madness contained the seeds of its own destruction. His complete disconnection from normal human emotion made him incapable of maintaining the political relationships necessary for survival. Allies abandoned him, not because of military defeats or policy disagreements, but because they couldn't psychologically tolerate being around someone so fundamentally inhuman. The end came in 1476, when Vlad was killed in battle, reportedly by his own men, who could no longer serve under someone whose madness had made him more dangerous to his followers than to his enemies. But even his death was shrouded in the same aesthetic madness that had defined his life. According to some accounts, his head was displayed on a stake in Constantinople, finally making him the subject of his own preferred art form. The legacy of Vlad's madness extended far beyond his short reign. His methods were so extreme that they entered folklore, eventually inspiring the vampire legends that would make his name immortal. But the real horror of his story lies not in supernatural tales, but in historical reality. The documented existence of a ruler who found genuine beauty in human suffering and had the power to transform his delusions into policy. Vlad's case demonstrates how madness and power can masquerade as strength, attracting followers who mistake cruelty for effectiveness. His principality did achieve a form of stability during his reign, not because his methods were successful, but because fear had eliminated all opposition. This created the illusion that extreme violence was a viable governing strategy, an illusion that would influence Eastern European political culture for centuries. More importantly, Vlad's story reveals how madness can be normalized through gradual exposure. His subjects and soldiers didn't suddenly decide to accept mass torture. They were gradually conditioned to see increasingly extreme behavior as normal. This process of normalization shows how entire societies can become complicit in the madness of their leaders, not through agreement, but through everyday psychological adaptation that makes the unbearable seem routine. The question that haunts historians studying Vlad's reign is whether his madness was unique or simply more extreme than usual. Medieval warfare was routinely brutal, and most rulers of the period used torture and execution as tools of statecraft. What made Vlad different was not his use of violence, but his aesthetic appreciation of it, his genuine belief that human suffering could be beautiful if properly arranged. This distinction is crucial because it reveals a particular type of madness that may be more common than we like to believe: the ability to find beauty in destruction, to see cruelty as creativity, and to mistake the absence of empathy for strength. Vlad's madness was not the dramatic, obvious insanity of rulers who thought they were gods or animals. It was the quiet, methodical madness of someone who had lost the fundamental human capacity to recognize suffering in others. In our modern world, We like to believe that such extreme disconnection from human emotion would be immediately recognized and stopped. But Vlad's story suggests otherwise. His madness was enabled by political necessity, justified by military success, and normalized through gradual exposure. The same mechanisms that allowed a medieval prince to turn torture into art could potentially operate in any society where power is concentrated and accountability is limited. The true horror of Vlad the Impaler lies not in the supernatural monster of legend, but in the historical reality of a human being so thoroughly disconnected from human emotion that he could orchestrate systematic suffering while genuinely believing he was creating something beautiful. His story serves as a dark reminder that the most dangerous madness may not be the kind that raves and screams, but the kind that smiles while arranging corpses and calls the result art. The crowd fell silent as the Roman emperor stepped into the Colosseum arena, not in the imperial box reserved for rulers, but on the blood-soaked sand where gladiators fought and died. Commodus, son of the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, raised his club toward the cheering masses and declared himself to be Hercules reborn, come to demonstrate his divine strength by personally fighting wild beasts and condemned criminals. What the crowd was witnessing wasn't just an unprecedented spectacle. It was the public breakdown of a man whose madness would bring the golden age of Rome crashing to an end. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus became emperor in 180 AD at the age of 19, inheriting the most stable and prosperous empire in human history. His father, Marcus Aurelius, had been the last of the 5 good emperors, philosopher kings, who had brought Rome to its cultural and territorial peak. For nearly a century, the empire had been ruled by men chosen for their competence rather than their bloodline. Commodus broke this pattern by being the first emperor in 84 years to inherit power through birth rather than adoption, and the results were catastrophic. The early signs of Commodus's instability appeared almost immediately after his accession. While his father had spent his reign on military campaigns defending the empire's borders, Commodus quickly abandoned all military responsibilities to focus on what he saw as his true calling, entertainment. But this wasn't the typical imperial interest in games and spectacles. Commodus believed he was literally a divine performer destined to demonstrate his godlike abilities before admiring crowds. His obsession began with chariot racing, a sport that was popular but considered beneath imperial dignity. Commodus didn't just watch races, he insisted on competing personally, despite the obvious security risks and political impropriety. But even more disturbing than his participation was his conviction that he possessed supernatural racing abilities. He claimed to be guided by the gods during races and would fly into violent rages when mechanical failures or accidents prevented him from winning. When palace officials tried to discourage his racing by pointing out the dangers, Commodus's response revealed the depth of his delusion. He explained patiently that he couldn't be injured during races because he was under divine protection. When a serious accident nearly killed him, he claimed it was a test sent by the gods to demonstrate his immortality. The crash that should have taught him caution instead reinforced his belief in his own supernatural nature. But chariot racing was only the beginning of Commodus's descent into madness. He gradually became convinced that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, the greatest hero in Roman mythology. This wasn't a metaphorical identification or a political pose. Commodus genuinely believed he possessed the mythical hero's supernatural strength and divine mission. He began dressing like Hercules, carrying a club instead of imperial regalia, and wearing a lion skin over his toga during official ceremonies. The transformation of the Roman emperor into a costumed mythological character would have been merely embarrassing if it had remained within the palace. But Commodus insisted on demonstrating his divine nature publicly, leading to spectacles that shocked even a population accustomed to imperial eccentricity. He began appearing in the Colosseum, not as a spectator, but as a performer, personally fighting gladiators and wild animals to prove his supernatural abilities. These weren't ceremonial combats with predetermined outcomes. Commodus insisted on real fights against genuine opponents, convinced that his divine nature would ensure victory regardless of the odds. Palace guards watched in terror as their emperor entered the arena armed only with a club, facing professional fighters or dangerous beasts while shouting about his mission from the gods. The fact that he usually won these encounters, probably due to opponents who were too frightened to harm him, only reinforced his delusions of invincibility. But Commodus's gladiatorial obsession went beyond personal combat. He began to see the entire Roman Empire as a vast arena created for his entertainment, with himself as both the star performer and the divine audience. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana and declared that all citizens were his supporting cast in an eternal gladiatorial show. Government meetings were conducted in the Colosseum, with senators forced to watch their emperor fight while conducting the business of empire. The psychological transformation was complete. Commodus had stopped seeing himself as a ruler responsible for governing an empire, and had become a delusional performer, convinced that reality itself was a stage created for his divine entertainment. Laws were issued not based on administrative necessity, but on their dramatic effect. Military campaigns were planned like theatrical productions, with more attention paid to visual spectacle than strategic objectives. This theatrical approach to governance had devastating practical consequences. While Commodus was playing gladiator, the empire's borders were under attack from Germanic tribes. The economy was struggling with inflation, and provincial governors were becoming increasingly independent. But when advisors tried to draw his attention to these problems, Commodus would dismiss them as distractions from his divine mission. In his mind, governing was less important than demonstrating his godlike nature to an adoring public. The most disturbing aspect of Commodus's madness was how it affected his relationship with violence. Unlike rulers whose madness led to random cruelty, Commodus developed a systematic approach to killing that he saw as artistic expression. He would personally execute condemned criminals in the arena, but he approached these killings as performance art, creating elaborate scenarios where he played different mythological characters, dispatching various types of villains. These execution performances became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. Commodus would spend days planning single executions, designing costumes, choreographing movements, and even composing dialogue that he would deliver while killing his victims. The condemned became unwilling actors in his mythological fantasies, forced to play specific roles in stories that always ended with their deaths at the hands of the divine emperor. But perhaps most revealing was how Commodus dealt with criticism of his performances. When spectators failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for his gladiatorial displays, he interpreted this not as disapproval of his behavior, but as evidence that they didn't understand his divine nature. He began having audience members executed for insufficient applause, claiming that their lack of appreciation proved they were enemies of the gods. This created a terrifying feedback loop where Commodus's delusions were constantly reinforced by the terror of those around him. The more people feared to criticize his performances, the more convinced he became that his divine nature was being recognized and celebrated. The absence of honest feedback pushed him deeper into madness, while those who might have helped him were too frightened to speak truthfully. The imperial court became a surreal theater where seasoned politicians and military commanders were forced to applaud enthusiastically as their emperor played dress-up and fought wild animals. Foreign ambassadors found themselves conducting diplomatic negotiations with a man wearing a lion's skin who insisted on being addressed as Hercules. The sight of the ruler of the world's greatest empire demanding to be called by the name of a mythological character challenged the basic assumptions about power and sanity that held the Roman world together. Commodus's madness reached its peak during the gladiatorial games he organized to celebrate his own divinity. These weren't traditional games with professional fighters. They were elaborate mythological pageants where Commodus played the hero in various legendary stories. He fought hundreds of opponents over several days, each combat designed to demonstrate different aspects of his divine nature. But the most chilling part of these spectacles was Commodus's genuine belief that he was providing a spiritual service to his people. He saw his gladiatorial performances not as entertainment, but as religious ceremonies, where he revealed divine truths through violence. After each victory, he would deliver speeches explaining the theological significance of what the audience had witnessed, treating his kills as sacred acts that brought him closer to full godhood. The economic cost of Commodus's madness was staggering. The games he staged to showcase his divine nature consumed vast resources that should have been used for defending borders and maintaining infrastructure. He bankrupted the imperial treasury, funding increasingly elaborate spectacles, while simultaneously neglecting the basic administrative functions that kept the empire running. The Roman military, left without adequate funding or leadership, began losing territory to barbarian invasions. But the psychological cost was even greater. Commodus's reign shattered the Roman people's faith in imperial authority and divine right. If the gods could choose a madman as emperor, if divine selection could produce someone who thought governing meant playing gladiator, then perhaps the entire system of imperial rule was based on delusion. This crisis of faith would contribute to the political instability that plagued Rome for the next century. The end came in 192 AD, when a conspiracy of senators, Praetorian guards, and even Commodus's own mistress finally acted to stop the madness. The emperor, who believed he was immortal, was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus. Hired by conspirators who could no longer tolerate being governed by someone who thought he was a mythological character. But Commodus's death couldn't undo the damage his 12-year reign had caused. The empire he had treated as his personal arena was economically devastated, militarily weakened, and politically fragmented. His assassination triggered a civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors, as different factions fought for control of an empire that had been fundamentally destabilized by more than a decade of madness masquerading as divine performance. The legacy of Commodus's madness extended far beyond immediate political consequences. His reign marked the end of the Pax Romana, the golden age of peace and prosperity that had lasted for 2 centuries. Future emperors would struggle with the precedent he had set, the idea that imperial power could be used for personal fantasy rather than public service. The Roman Empire would eventually recover from his reign, but it would never again achieve the stability and confidence that had characterized the era before his madness took hold. More profoundly, Commodus's story reveals how madness in power can transform not just policy, but the very nature of political authority. When a ruler begins to see governance as performance art and citizens as audience members in his personal drama, the basic social contract between ruler and ruled breaks down completely. The empire becomes not a political entity, but a stage set with all the chaos and instability that such a transformation imply. The emperor who thought he was Hercules serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when power becomes divorced from responsibility, when leadership is replaced by performance, and when the person charged with protecting civilization decides instead to use it as raw material for personal fantasy. In Commodus, Rome got a ruler who was simultaneously too mad to govern effectively and too powerful to be stopped until it was too late. A combination that brought one of history's greatest civilizations to the brink of collapse. In the myth-shrouded peaks of the Bavarian Alps, a magnificent castle rises like something from a child's storybook. Turrets and towers reaching toward the clouds, every surface decorated with scenes from Germanic mythology. But Neuschwanstein Castle, Ludwig II's most famous creation, was never meant to be visited by tourists or admired by the public. It was built as a private retreat for a king who had retreated so far from reality that he lived entirely in a world of fairy tales, spending his kingdom's entire treasury to build the fantasy palaces where he could hide from the responsibilities of ruling. Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm became King of Bavaria in 1864 at the age of 18, inheriting a small but wealthy German kingdom at one of the most tumultuous periods in European history. The German states were consolidating under Prussian leadership, and Bavaria's independence was increasingly threatened by larger, more powerful neighbors. What Ludwig's kingdom needed was a pragmatic ruler who could navigate these dangerous political waters. What it got was a young man whose response to political pressure was to disappear into an elaborate fantasy world of his own creation. The early signs of Ludwig's detachment from reality appeared almost immediately after his coronation. While other European monarchs of the 1860s were dealing with the realities of industrialization, nationalism, and changing social structures, Ludwig became obsessed with recreating the medieval past. He wasn't interested in studying history or preserving traditions. He wanted to literally live in a fairy tale version of the Middle Ages that existed nowhere but in his imagination. This wasn't mere romanticism or nostalgia. Ludwig genuinely believed that he could transform Bavaria into a real-life fairy tale kingdom by building the appropriate settings and surrounding himself with the right theatrical props. He began commissioning castles, palaces, and gardens based not on historical models, but on stage designs from Wagner's operas and illustrations from children's books. In his mind, creating the physical environment of a fairy tale would somehow make the fantasy real. The first major project was Linderhof Palace, built between 1874 and 1878. From the outside, it appeared to be a modest royal residence in the Rococo style. But inside, Ludwig had created something that belonged more in a theme park than a functioning palace. Every room was designed to represent a different fairy tale or myth, with mechanical devices that created artificial weather, hidden passages for dramatic entrances, and even an underground grotto complete with artificial lake and colored lighting effects. But Linderhof was just the beginning. As Ludwig's grip on reality weakened, his building projects became increasingly ambitious and divorced from practical considerations. He announced plans for Herrenchiemsee Palace, a replica of Versailles that was intended to demonstrate his equal status with the Sun King Louis XIV. The fact that Bavaria was a small kingdom with limited resources didn't matter to Ludwig. In his fantasy world, he was as powerful and wealthy as any monarch in history. The construction of these palaces revealed the depth of Ludwig's detachment from reality. He would spend days studying architectural plans, but not from the perspective of cost, functionality, or structural feasibility. Instead, he evaluated designs based on how well they matched his vision of what a fairy tale castle should look like. When architects protested that his requirements were impossible or prohibitively expensive, he would dismiss them and find new architects willing to attempt the impossible. Ludwig's madness wasn't just about building castles. It was about creating an entire alternate reality where he could live as the fairy tale king he believed himself to be. He established elaborate court ceremonies based on medieval legends rather than Bavarian traditions. He commissioned fantastical costumes that made him look like characters from Germanic mythology. He even had a mechanical horse installed in one of his castles, so he could pretend to ride through imaginary landscapes without ever leaving his bedroom. But perhaps most disturbing was Ludwig's relationship with Richard Wagner, the composer whose operas provided much of the inspiration for Ludwig's fantasy world. Ludwig didn't just patronize Wagner's art. He became convinced that he was living inside Wagner's mythological universe. He saw himself as one of Wagner's heroes, destined to create a perfect kingdom where art and reality merged into something sublime and eternal. This relationship with Wagner revealed Ludwig's complete inability to distinguish between artistic inspiration and practical governance. He would attend Wagner's operas not as entertainment, but as religious experiences, convinced that the composer was revealing divine truths about kingship and destiny. He spent vast sums commissioning private performances where he was often the only audience member, sitting alone in ornate theaters, while entire orchestras and opera companies performed just for him. The financial cost of Ludwig's fantasy world was staggering. By the 1880s, he was spending more on his building projects than the entire annual budget of the Bavarian government. When his finance ministers protested that the kingdom was approaching bankruptcy, Ludwig's response was to dismiss them and borrow more money. In his mind, a fairy tale king shouldn't have to worry about mundane concerns like budgets and debt. Such things belonged to the ordinary world he was trying to escape. But Ludwig's madness had consequences that extended far beyond Bavaria's finances. His complete withdrawal from political responsibilities left the kingdom effectively rudderless during one of the most critical periods in German history. While he was designing throne rooms and commissioning artificial grottos, Prussia was consolidating its control over the German states through a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure. The political vacuum created by Ludwig's madness allowed Prussian officials to effectively colonize Bavaria's government. They installed their own advisors, influenced policy decisions, and gradually reduced Bavaria from an independent kingdom to a Prussian satellite state. Ludwig either didn't notice or didn't care. He was too busy planning his next castle to pay attention to the loss of his kingdom's sovereignty. The most tragic aspect of Ludwig's condition was how it affected his personal relationships. He became increasingly isolated, seeing other people not as individuals, but as characters in his elaborate fantasy. Court officials were assigned roles based on fairy tales, rather than their actual positions or competencies. He would address his ministers as if they were knights in a medieval romance, expecting them to respond with equally theatrical language and behavior. Ludwig's romantic life was equally distorted by his detachment from reality. He became engaged to his cousin Sophie, but only because he had cast her in the role of a fairy tale princess in his personal mythology. When the actual woman failed to match his fantasy expectations, he broke off the engagement and retreated even further into his imaginary world. He never married, apparently unable to form genuine relationships with people who insisted on existing as themselves, rather than as characters in his stories. As Ludwig's castles neared completion, his behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He would disappear for days at a time, wandering through his empty palaces while talking to himself or to imaginary companions. Servants reported finding him conducting elaborate conversations with portraits on the walls, treating painted figures as if they were real people who could respond to his questions and commands. The final phase of Ludwig's reign showed his complete break from reality. He began issuing royal decrees that made sense only within his fantasy world, ordering the construction of additional castles that would have bankrupted Bavaria 10 times over. He planned a project to build a replica of ancient Babylon in the Bavarian countryside, complete with hanging gardens and a Tower of Babel. When reminded that such projects were impossible, he would fly into rages, insisting that anything was possible for a king who truly believed in magic. The end came in 1886, when Ludwig's own government finally acted to remove him from power. A commission of psychiatrists declared him mentally unfit to rule, based on reports from palace staff about his increasingly bizarre behavior. But the irony was that many of these same officials had enabled his madness for years, accepting his fantasy world as long as it didn't interfere too dramatically with their own interests. Ludwig was placed under house arrest at Berg Castle, but he died under mysterious circumstances just days later, found drowned in Lake Starnberg, along with the psychiatrist who had been assigned to treat him. Whether his death was suicide, accident, or something more sinister remains a mystery that has never been solved. But Ludwig's legacy lives on in the fairy tale castles that nearly bankrupted Bavaria, but now attract millions of tourists annually. Neuschwanstein Castle, his most famous creation, became the inspiration for Disney's Sleeping Beauty Castle and serves as the ultimate symbol of fairy tale romance. The irony is that Ludwig's madness, which was seen as a disaster in his lifetime, has become Bavaria's greatest tourist attraction and economic asset. Yet beneath the romantic tourist appeal lies a darker truth about Ludwig's reign. His story demonstrates how madness in power can be enabled and even celebrated when it produces beautiful artifacts, even as it destroys the lives of those who must live with its consequences. The peasants who paid crushing taxes to fund Ludwig's fantasy castles, the officials who watched their kingdom's independence disappear while their king played dress-up, and the future generations who inherited a debt-ridden state received no benefit from the fairy tale palaces that now define Ludwig's legacy. Ludwig II's madness was different from the violent insanity of rulers like Caligula or Ivan the Terrible. His delusions didn't lead to mass executions or brutal tortures. They led to something that might seem less harmful, but was ultimately just as destructive to those under his rule. Ludwig's retreat into fantasy represented an abdication of responsibility that left his people vulnerable to exploitation, and his kingdom open to absorption by more aggressive neighbors. The fairy tale king's story serves as a warning about a particular type of madness that can be especially seductive: the madness of those who use power not to harm others directly, but to create beautiful distractions from the ugly realities of governance. Ludwig's castles are undeniably magnificent, his vision undeniably romantic, and his story undeniably tragic. But behind the fairy tale facade lies the harsh reality of a ruler whose madness, however beautiful its manifestations, ultimately betrayed everyone who depended on him for leadership and protection. In the end, Ludwig got his wish. He became the eternal fairy tale king he dreamed of being. But the cost was paid by others. The kingdom that lost its independence, the people who suffered under crushing taxes, and the future generations who inherited the consequences of his beautiful madness. His story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous rulers are not those who wield power viciously, but those who abandon it entirely in pursuit of personal fantasy. As we reach the end of our journey through the twisted corridors of power, where madness reigns supreme, one question haunts us above all others. Are we watching the past, or are we looking into a mirror that reflects our own time? From Caligula's war against the sea to Ludwig's fairy tale castles, from Ivan's iron-tipped staff to George III's conversations with trees, we've witnessed how the human mind can fracture under the weight of absolute power, taking entire civilizations down with it. But these aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings written in blood and carved in stone, messages from the past that speak directly to our present moment. The rulers we've encountered tonight shared certain disturbing characteristics that transcend time and culture. Each began with promise, each had moments of apparent sanity, and each possessed enough charisma or power to convince others to enable their madness. Most importantly, each believed their delusions were not just justified, but necessary, even noble. The emperor who thought he was a god, the king who forgot he was human, the czar who killed his son, all were convinced they were serving some higher purpose. This is perhaps the most chilling lesson from our exploration. Madness in power rarely announces itself with obvious symptoms. It creeps in slowly, disguised as strength, justified by necessity, enabled by those who fear the consequences of speaking truth to power. The same courtiers who applauded Nero's terrible poetry, the same nobles who pretended Charles VI's delusions were normal. The same officials who funded Ludwig's fantasy castles, they all played their part in enabling destruction because confronting madness seemed more dangerous than accommodating it. But here's what should truly terrify us. The mechanisms that allowed these rulers to maintain power despite their obvious madness still exist today. The tendency to mistake cruelty for strength, to confuse paranoia with vigilance, to enable destructive behavior because challenging it seems impossible or dangerous. These patterns haven't disappeared with the advent of modern democracy or psychological understanding. We like to believe that our modern safeguards, our constitutions and checks and balances would prevent such madness from taking hold. But every ruler we've discussed tonight had advisors, had institutions, had people around them who could have acted to limit the damage. Yet in each case, those safeguards failed, not because they were poorly designed, but because they were operated by human beings who made the same rational calculations that humans always make when confronted with power. Survival first, principles second. The madness of absolute power isn't just about individual psychology, it's about the systems that enable and sustain that madness. Caligula's horse became a consul because senators were too afraid to object. Ivan's secret police terrorized Russia because bureaucrats chose compliance over resistance. Ludwig's fairy tale castles bankrupted Bavaria because ministers found it easier to borrow money than to confront their king's delusions. Each of these cases shows us that madness in power doesn't require the majority of people to become insane. It only requires them to become complicit. The guards who restrained Justin II's victims, the courtiers who applauded Commodus's gladiatorial performances, the architects who built Ludwig's impossible castles, They weren't mad themselves, but they enabled madness because the alternative seemed too dangerous to contemplate. This is why these stories matter today. We don't need to worry about future rulers declaring themselves gods or building fairy tale castles. We need to worry about our own capacity to normalize the abnormal, to rationalize the irrational, to accommodate the unacceptable, because confronting it seems too risky or too difficult. The rulers we've examined tonight left behind more than just ruins and graveyards. They left behind precedents. They showed that madness can be sustained in power for years or even decades if enough people choose to look the other way. They demonstrated that institutions designed to prevent tyranny can be corrupted or bypassed if those operating them value their own safety more than their stated principles. But perhaps most importantly, they remind us that power doesn't corrupt in the abstract. It corrupts through specific human decisions made by real people in real moments. Every time someone chose to applaud Nero's poetry instead of walking away, every time someone decided to fund Ludwig's castles instead of protecting the treasury, every time someone enabled madness instead of confronting it, they were participating in the destruction of the very societies they claimed to serve. The madness of power is not just about the individual rulers who lose their grip on reality. It's about all of us and our willingness to enable that madness when it seems safer than opposing it. The most terrifying lesson from tonight's journey is not that mad rulers exist, but that sane people consistently choose to serve them. As we look around our modern world, as we watch our own leaders and evaluate our own political systems, the question isn't whether we might encounter madness in power, it's whether we'll recognize it when we see it, and whether we'll have the courage to act when recognition isn't enough. The 10 rulers we've examined tonight serve as a warning, but also as a challenge. They show us the price of accommodation, the cost of complicity, and the terrible consequences of choosing safety over truth. Their stories remind us that defending sanity in power isn't just the responsibility of leaders. It's the responsibility of everyone who chooses to follow them. The madness of power survives because it finds willing accomplices in ordinary people who convince themselves that accommodation is wisdom, that enabling is loyalty, and that silence is safety. But history judges these accomplices just as harshly as it judges the mad rulers they served, because in the end, madness in power is only as strong as the support it receives from those who know better but choose to do nothing. The voices of the past are calling to us across the centuries, warning us through the screams of Caligula's victims, the tears of Ivan's children, the empty treasuries left by Ludwig's dreams. They're asking us one simple question. When madness comes to power in your time, will you be the one who speaks truth, or will you be the one who applauds the lies? The answer to that question may determine not just our individual fate, but the fate of the civilization we leave behind. What other stories of power and madness throughout history intrigue you? The patterns we've explored tonight continue to repeat across cultures and centuries, and understanding them may be our best defense against living through them ourselves. If this exploration of power and madness throughout history has captivated you, there are countless other stories waiting to be told. Consider subscribing to join us on future journeys through the darkest corridors of human history, where the line between civilization and chaos proves far thinner than we ever imagined.